this lecture came about through two different means. One was having taught anatomy for close to 30 years at various art schools. One of the lectures that I would often give was the history of the nude in Western art and when we use it, because it sort of became interesting how people would study anatomy and study from the life figure but not know what to do with it. So I thought, well, maybe I could fill in with this lecture. So this, how it was used, when it was used, why it was used, and different types of nudity, etc. And one season I was invited out to the Woodmere Gallery to give the study or whatever of the nude in Western art. And the night before I was to give the lecture, the sponsor called and she said, you know, I really don't know, I've never met you, I don't know your work. She went on my website, I walked in the next day, she wouldn't come up from the basement where her office was. She didn't come up until about a second before the slide lecture was on. And I thought, oh no, she saw Jesus. She went to the website, she saw the work I do, and she hates me. So anyway, she sat down and she essentially heckled through the entire lecture. And afterwards, some of the people in the audience said, gee, are things getting any better? Are you seeing students able to do this? And I said, yeah, but you know, just the other day in the academy, a teacher was walking through and she told her students to shield their eyes because there was a nude in one of the galleries. And she hollers out from the back, you can thank the Catholic Church for that. And whatever just, I don't remember thinking about it. I just said, oh no, actually the Catholic Church is the safest place in the world for the nude. And I got back and I talked to one of my co-teachers, also Catholic, and I said, Patrick Connors, I just gave this lecture and it was just terrible the way it turned out. And he said, Anthony, you've got to change the title. You call it The Need for the Nude in the Catholic Church. I said, well, I'll work on that title a little bit. But anyway, I realized that it really, this vocabulary, this use of it has never, ever been developed anywhere else but within the Catholic Church. And so tonight it's going to really be an investigation of that, why we use it, how we use it, when we use it, and where are we now with it. But anyway, there's no doubt about it that the nude itself is a development of, all right, Matthew, you could say it's born in the Mediterranean basin. And for the very reasons that we later on use it in the Catholic Church, which is to give something an outward sign of an inward something. In most cases, to make something sacred. In most cases, to make something separate from the worldly. So the Greeks give us this whole thing of all gods and goddesses are not only personifications of some other force, but also to always be shown nude. Clothing becomes this sign and symbol of the worldliness of things, the mundane, something that no god or goddess should ever wear. So this is a big part of Western culture. And you know, here's an example of, say, not god and goddesses, but the wrestlers, gymnasium, nudity. They studied from the nude. There was very little anatomy actually done at this time. The only records we have is by an anatomist named Galen, who basically could study accident victims, you know, charioteers, things like that. We're not sure if there was any real dissection going on at the time. They know that he did dissections of dogs and some Barbary apes because the structures don't correlate to ours exactly, but nonetheless was done by observation. This is from Pompeii, 79 AD, right? So we know what kind of form sense was available at the time. But this is from the same period, catacombs. And we have to understand we're an underground culture now. We can't really commission high-ranking artists from the Republic above. You know, so our first artists and artisans are very primitive, very crude, but yet understand very clearly the use of the nude in Catholic art. Early fresco of Adam and Eve. Of course, the Byzantine school has no problem with it either. What's interesting in the Byzantine school is this culture that had probably the highest development of nude sculpture in the round does a complete reversal in order to make it look Catholic, look divine, which is to nullify the space by giving it a gold background. And no perspective, all right? Zero perspective. Nothing diminishes. This is infinity. This is God's space. This is divine. So again, the signs and symbols for making Catholic art change dramatically. And I say Catholic because at that point there was still no division, no schism. We see early signs of an attempt in the Middle Ages for an anatomical type figure. This more of a Christus triumphans, eyes opened, non-suffering Christ. This is Cross of San Damiano. And we notice right after, oops, sorry, Matthew, you warned me about that. Actually, after the death of St. Francis, there's this big change. And this Christus Patiens starts to take over. And more attention is paid to what seems to be an attempt to make a physiognomy a little more clearer and give it a greater sense of presence. And also something that looks a little closer to what we look like. So we enter this new realm of it's like me, but it's not like me. Right, which is very, very important in Catholic art. Very important. It can't be so remote that we can't relate to the form at all, but it can't be so much like us, say like in a photograph or a body cast, that it looks just like me. So we find out that during this period, the gravity of the Christ figure gets heavier and heavier and heavier, and until we reach this sort of pinnacle of these two worlds, the Byzantine world and the early Renaissance. This is what we call, I was talking to Matthew earlier, I said, you know, we are definitely at some turning point in Catholic art and architecture, there's no doubt about it. Hopefully it'll be a real one, it'll hold, and not like what we called the false Renaissance. Not that it was false, but there was a beginning, a new beginning in the 12th and 13th centuries, all to die through the plague. So we have like two periods, one before 1348 and one after. This one particular cross, the Cimabue, which unfortunately was destroyed in the flood, always gets heralded as that turning point for the artist because it really looks like somebody's really looking at the figure and trying to get it, and trying to have a Christ expressive of redemption, salvation through this act of crucifixion. And following with Giotto, his student, it gets clearer and clearer that we are observing the human figure here, trying to include as much actual anatomy as possible. The idea of, I think that, that through this use of the body, we're basically, in Catholic art, after three particular things: presence, witness, and transfiguration. That somehow we seek an art form that will do all three. And presence, there's a Cimabue again, sorry. By presence, it means that the thing we're looking at has to be complete. It has to be congruous. Its parts have to look like they belong to it. It has to have a front, a back, a top, a side, a bottom. The Incarnation, right? I sometimes, when dealing with, a figure in the round where, and there have been clergy that will comment, well, it's a little this and it's a little, you're showing this, and I'll just say, Father, what part of the Incarnation didn't you like? Really, think about it. This is a Cimabue as well, and it's Francis of Assisi, but he does something different here in that going from the Byzantine tradition of a Maestà painting having the angels surrounding the Madonna enthroned with the Christ child, he actually put St. Francis on the same ground plane. This is something absolutely unique in Catholic art, where in other cults, the gods and goddesses are here and the humans are over here or below, or there's another frame or another predella. You don't enter that space. Not in the Catholic world. We are brought up. We are brought up to live with Christ and Mary on the same plane. That's what they want. And of course, he changes the background. It's not all gold, it's blue. It's our sky. It's the world we live in. So this entry of, just as we say, the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us, now we're actually realizing that it dwelt amongst us in our world. Francis, of course, understands this idea of stripping, having done it himself, stripping in front of the bishop. And we start to understand that by 1401, there are 4 distinct types of nudity within the Catholic Church, all used very, very well. And they're all evident in the Ghiberti Doors. First one is nuditas virtualis, virtuous nudity, the nudity of casting off your clothing to the world. I am needless. So even in the Byzantine icon that we saw earlier, Christ is wearing nothing. This is a Duccio version of the same thing. Nuditas naturalis, the type of nudity you're born into. It is your natural state. And nuditas criminalis. So the creation of Adam and Eve are nuditas naturalis, after the expulsion. And this is really what defines the difference between nude and naked. Nude is needless, naked is obviously in need of. And when we think of it scripturally, when God is walking through the garden asking Adam and Eve, why are you hiding? Because we're naked. Who told you you were naked? Now, what that might have meant in terms of scripture, all we know is it meant without. So the sin is not nudity or nakedness or genitalia as much as the belief that God made something incomplete. So it's not just the sin of disobedience. The fall is not just the sin of disobedience, but the sin of being ashamed for the good that God made. It's a real important point there, this shame of how we are designed. Creation of Eve. So this contact, or of course we see it in Michelangelo, where these 2 hands are reaching. It's ages old. Samson, again from the Ghiberti Doors, virtuous nudity. St. John in the desert, casting off his robe. You think about this and you say, this is Catholic art that was in churches, and some of it still is. This is, of course, still in the Brancacci Chapel in Florence. St. Peter baptizing. Conditional nuditas, nuditas temporalis. Now, in Catholic art, because we're so rich, we can get to play a couple things here. So something like the circumcision of Christ it's nuditas naturalis virtualis, and temporalis, conditional. Stripping of one's clothing. Again, this is shame. Nuditas criminalis, the nudity of the nakedness of Noah. It's not the nudity of Noah, it's the nakedness of Noah. This is again from the Ghiberti Doors. So in those 10 panels, we've got the entire vocabulary down. This is the cleaned Masaccio. Prior to 1984, the genitals of both Adam and Eve were completely covered with ivy leaves that had been done, I think, in the 18th century. And after the cleaning, they said, this is what was intended. And obviously, it was agreed upon.
Why was it clean? Why was it clean?
Because it wasn't the hand of Masaccio.
No, why were the leaves removed?
Because he didn't paint them. Oh. Okay, all right. I was just talking about this. There are schools and philosophies of conservation. How much, like in the 60s, they would get a fresco, and anything that wasn't the hand of Giotto, they'd chop away and then make these white blotches all over the place. And it looked like, I was in school then, it looked like an abstract expressionist painting. Wow, they were just, so ahead of their time. And then in the 80s, this new school came along, which some people have problems with, I don't, that the doctor and dottoressa who are in charge of, Belli Arti cleaned everything as if it had been painted yesterday. Botticelli got cleaned, Sistine Chapel ceiling got cleaned, all that happened during that same period. So anything that wasn't of the hand of Masaccio was removed and cleaned as if it had been painted yesterday. This falls under the category of criminalis, Christ being stripped, the despoliation. And we again, are we getting this context of just how degrading this was? To be publicly stripped like this. It's hard for us to conceive. Of course we understand the sacrifice, we hope to. But the absolute humiliation that went with this. Again, whether it's the Maestà, the Virgin enthroned, or the crucifixion, again, the Catholic Church brings its saints to the same level. It brings us to the same level. Donors, everybody. But this idea of the actual corpus in the round takes a while to develop. And this is Brunelleschi, completely nude, carved in wood. And, there's always this romantic idea that, again, the church is so horrible and wouldn't allow dissections. And, Michelangelo and Leonardo had to sneak these dissections in. Didn't happen. Didn't happen that way. What happened was there was a papal bull written by Pope Urban during the Crusades. This is Michelangelo's also carved crucifix. And the title of it was the Mos Teutonicus, the German way. And it basically was, it forbade the boiling of the corpus to retrieve the bones. Why would the church get involved with that? Well, there's the Crusades, and we don't have X-rays, we don't have DNA, we don't have CAT scans, we have got nothing. Somebody knocks on your door and says, Mrs. whatever, Johnny died over in Palestine, and here's his bones. And you don't know if it's a pig, jackass, whatever. Or, we got the index finger of the Baptist, and it could be an oxtail. Right? So the church, no, seriously, so the church, because of those two things, the desire to repatriate crusaders lost in the Holy Land, and the selling of fictitious body parts and relics, boiling of a body to extricate the bones must stop now. But dissection, at least one a year, a public dissection, and of a criminal, someone who refused to confess, was permissible. So this is this early school of, that slide was an early school of where there were these open dissections. We have to remember the art student of the Renaissance was already far beyond the medical student of Bologna or Padua or Paris, because they were still studying the humors and the four temperaments. But this idea of who and what we are in terms of this circle, square, this is Fra Pacioli, this Vitruvian man comes into play again. The reintroduction of the Hellenic and the Roman world into Renaissance thinking. And of course, Da Vinci is the one that nails it. And we use this as symbol for so many things, usually health, athletics, but it is really, truly, if one could say, a map of heaven. He nails it in the sense, and you don't notice it, but he does two things. He makes the navel the center of the circle being the symbol of the eternal. Every point is equal from the center. The square being the symbol of the mundane, the temporal, four sides. Root of the genitals is the center of the square. And the navel becomes the root of the circle. He overlaps it, and we have this. It turns into a golden section. He gives us, you don't have to read it backwards, even read Italian. He gives the scale right on the bottom of the proportions, down to the finger. So he says, this is a palm. Da Vinci uses this as a model, this circle square, this idea of the church coming together, both the eternal and the temporal, the heavenly and the mundane are together within the circle square design. In fact, the Vatican is based on that. We can't quite see it at first. So he makes these models. And of course, we have it in Todi, where the circle square church comes together. They are hard. And we've seen a lot of modernist architects try to attempt it and fail because they wind up doing that sort of fan-shaped thing. But we seem to settle for the one that's based on the body, this Christ lying down. This is Francesco Di Giorgio. And some early churches will even have the ambulatory section tilted to the side a bit to give the feeling of the head leaning over on the cross. But there's another thing that happens in this search, or this want to describe the incarnation, which is once we get anatomy, then we have to put it in space. Again, this is something that is, as I was teaching, I started to think, how did all these lessons come together? And it wasn't just to make, of course it was to make art, but art about what? And when we think about light and shade, anatomy, perspective, it's all to describe the incarnation. Christ in space, Christ in our space, and us with Christ in that mutual environment. And of course, we as bodies enter this cavity of a body that we in turn are mimicking. The mystical body is reflected in us as well as we are in it. But as parts, and this is something that always amazes me, especially in terms of Eucharist. We, the part, receive the whole. We, the part, we all go up and get a little, and it's not. We receive the whole body. We receive the whole body. And again, another example of everybody is clothed in terms of decorum, in terms of who and what they are. Christ's child is nude. Again, brought up into perspective. Again, Da Vinci in this, I often look at this drawing, I think what a wonderful, sort of poster or whatever for the pro-life movement. I put this on my Facebook page one time. I wrote on it, because I saw this kid carrying a poster and it said, pretend I'm a tree and save me. But this idea, again, of this is where it goes back and forth. Here's the reliefs of Della Robbia outside the Hospital of the Innocents. Again, this natural anatomy or natural condition. Is it the Christ child, or are they just orphans? This idea of the Christ is in every human being. Every orphan that comes through these doors is an innocent, innocenti. So he does these 8 reliefs. And this idea of Christ always being presented in the nude throughout Renaissance and Counter-Reformation art, and what I call Reformation art, which we call mannerism now. This other concept of partial nudity of the Virgin Mary, the lactating Madonna that Da Vinci does. We could do a whole lecture just on this one theme. And again, you say, how did we lose this? Just as we're dealing with the two natures of Christ, the human and the divine, Our Lady is now always just with one breast exposed, human and divine. Again, this lactating virgin who, in this covered and uncovered, is also expressing the human and divine nature of the Christ child she nurses. Of course, anatomy is also used to express our saints. One thing Da Vinci became very, very interested in was the psychology within the head. And he said, I have to find that point of what he called common sense, but his senso comunale, something that everybody knows, something that everybody shares. But he felt that it was again, you use the body to express an internal thought, feeling, idea. And here you can see this little diagram here where he really thinks it's a physical point somewhere. And who knows, it could be. but with these cross sections. This idea of cross sections, by the way, is really, really important in Catholic art. We like it. We like something that have height, width, and depth, all three axes, all the time. Of course, Michelangelo follows this, but Michelangelo is a cusp artist. He's before and after Reformation, and it's very, very interesting. That's why we termed it Reformation art. We call it mannerism, and there's an elongation of proportions. Here, this is one of the dying slaves, and his Christ figure. The garment was added later. This is his resurrection figure. The bronze was added later. Michelangelo had done the figure completely nude. And when you think about the Sistine Chapel wasn't covered until after the Protestant Revolution. After. There's a whole switch that happens. And Michelangelo, Pontormo, Fiorentino Rosso, El Greco all follow into line with this. Let me continue here with a little bit more of Michelangelo. Creation of Eve, Nuditatis Naturalis, again, same sort of theme. So Michelangelo's really, on the right beach at the right time for the right wave. Of course, he's inventive, don't misunderstand me, but we had already had this vocabulary within the Catholic tradition. Nakedness of Noah, again. So he does Nuditatis Temporalis, the flood. He also is very familiar with these four types, of course. And, the epitome of this, the Last Judgment. This is unveiled October 31st, what's the date? 15-something. And before, Vesalius writes his anatomy book. Again, the mind of the arts in terms of human anatomy is way beyond the medical field. This sort of body electric he's actually doing almost a flayed figure, if you look at it. It can't get more nude. It even looks like it's missing skin. But when we look at this sort of Last Judgment throughout Catholic history, we find out that, again, it demanded the nude and the naked. Both are there. In fact, in these medieval carvings, it became very hard for some of the early bishops and clergy to convince the sculptors that when you're doing the Last Judgment and you're doing the elect and the damned, they must be nude. Well, the elect are nude, the damned are naked. You can't forget that one. I find this one fascinating, where this partially clothed Christ is showing the souls the crucifixion. I mean, this kind of invention, this kind of presentation, we wonder what, how did we lose this? We didn't lose it. It's still there. We have access to it anytime we want. Now, what's interesting is damned and both the damned and the elect are all about the same age, if you notice that. And the idea here in the church was that you're 33 years old. You're all 33 in the resurrection body. Again, we are offered to look like, in God's likeness, the resurrection body of Christ. 33. This is Signorelli. This is in the Cathedral at Orvieto. And you see by the skeleton, he probably never saw a real skeleton. He understood surface anatomy, but never saw a real skeleton. But made them solid, quite solid. And it's just a lot of the this is all from some form of observation. We know that, but the idea of actually having a model sit in front of you, not available. But again, and this continues into the Counter-Reformation period, where you can see same thing, all 33 years. The mystical body of the resurrection. But of course, the artist at the same time is, once the hanger is there, once the armature of the body is there, the separating this and studying drapery individually becomes as mandatory. Because it also has a significant role in the play of the nude in Catholic art. And of course, this is, what can you say about the Rome Pietà? The role of drapery here becomes very significant in when the body of Christ is touched before, as Scripture says, noli me tangere, don't touch me, I haven't yet risen to the Father. This idea of Mary's hand, Our Lady's hand, touching her son with a cloth between it, is the humeral veil. She's touching the body of Christ. Mary's aware of this. Michelangelo's aware of it too. He does it here again in this Pitti Tondo. This one is this is Iglesia on the cornerstone. This is the right arm of the Christ child separating the book, new and old, the new covenant. Again, she's got her arm around with a cloth in the middle. So this sort of metaphor is incredibly rich, and we're the owners of it. We're the heirs and owners of it. This is Pontormo. Now, in what I mentioned earlier about Reformation art, what happens after the Protestant Revolt is Trent sort of comes down, not heavily on ours, but realizes that something's not right. Maybe we should have been looking at this a little bit further. That this whole rational thing that happens in the Renaissance of a logistic constancy of form, space, light, time, very, very rational existence of Christ among us. Maybe we should look to the Gothic and actually make this recommendation that maybe we're losing some of the mystical there. And of course, Pontormo, you can see this in this sort of form doesn't equal void in Mannerist painting, what we call Mannerist painting. There's a tumbling of space and figure here. Of course, Matthew, how did I do that? I want to go back to that, El Greco. Matthew, left button. And then what? Lose the mouse to go. No. Oh boy, go up. Nuts. I do go. Use the mouse. Did that. No. It doesn't go. Why doesn't? Yeah, thanks. Anyway, El Greco is primed for it because he's trained in, of course, the Orthodox tradition. He really can, that's it. It's not, again, the modernist eye in art history looks at this as just trying to be creative. The figures are out of scale with each other. It doesn't make sense, and it's not supposed to. It's intentional. And I sometimes look at what's happened in terms of modernism. I think at some point in time we will call modernism our mannerism. Not a good one. Wasn't a good manner, but it is. You can realize that for the past 40 years we've been seeing some very, very, very mannered figures. But again, I think some of it was done for art's sake. This is not. This is really done for theological reasons. He also understands the different types of nudity. But the big jump we need here is Ignatius of Loyola and the Counter-Reformation art, which again in our historical terms we'll call the Baroque, but it really is Counter-Reformation art. And I like to think of it as, if you didn't like the flesh of the Renaissance, you're really not going to like the muscle of the Baroque. Watch out. And if there's one thing that we understand through the spiritual exercises is this sense of witness. And if the Renaissance introduced this idea of presence to us, it is Counter-Reformation art that really teaches us how to do sense of witness, that it is ongoing. It is ongoing. It is in terms of light and form and space, something that is convincing, but there's a sense of ongoing to it, and that we can participate in that ongoing. And it all leads to one thing, that we want to touch the crucified Christ. We want to touch the resurrected body, as much as Christ wants us to as well. We are always invited to. And it's something we have to remember. I mean, the incredulity of Thomas is, I think, one of my favorite themes because of that, the invitation. We kind of focus on the doubt of Thomas, but it's still an invitation that he is welcome to. The null space of the Byzantine or the earlier periods is now represented with this darkness, the tenebrism. And of course, the school is called the Tenebristi, but it really is, again, through Ignatius of Loyola, that light is introduced slowly, that we have the spirituality of light and we have the spirituality of darkness, that we can find our way through the dark as well. That little by little, light is entering the room day by day. So we don't really know the light source of these things. And here's our patron for the day, St. Joseph touching the Christ child. Again, sense of movement ongoing. And of course, our saints and martyrs go through the same despoliation, the same stripping, the same nuditas criminalis, virtualis, all combined. There is an exhibition right now at the National Gallery in DC. It'll be up till the 3rd of May. I would highly recommend you see it. This is one of the works that's in it. The idea of witness and realism, but not realism for realism's sake, but again, this idea of it is with us, really becomes so manifest in Spanish art and Spanish painting and sculpture. These are carved wooden pieces. This with glass eyes. This one's haunting. It will just, I mean, no one talks in this exhibition, thank God. It's called The Sacred Made Real. It's a smaller version of the exhibit. It traveled in Spain and England. Most of the I mean, you really do get a sense of the sacred here, not the real. It's not sort of like going up to one of those taxidermy figures, the body cast with all the real clothes, and you go, oh, I thought it was a security guard, and it's not, It's not that kind of thing. It doesn't, it's really engaging. It's not startling for theatrics. It's truly engaging. And, but the sense of suffering is just amazing in these sculptures. And again, this is where the influence of the East comes in, where the flesh is mundane, but the clothes become glory. Now, anatomy is going through the same thing. If there's Counter-Reformation art, there's Counter-Reformation anatomy. Again, it's just something that gets to Rome and doesn't let go. St. Agatha. And even though you see that she's suffered her martyrdom, again, the use of flesh here becomes very, very important. She's alive. This is from Caravaggio's seven Corporal Works of Mercy, where this thing was called Roman charity, where lactating women would go to the prisons and feed the older men. But he does a twofer here. This is actually visit the imprisoned and feed the hungry. There wasn't enough room in the, so it's very inventive. And again, this is the Catholic imagination You know, a secular artist wouldn't have to even conceive of this. I don't have enough room. How am I going to do visiting the imprisoned and feeding the hungry all at once? Here's St. Bernard, miracle of lactating Madonna. Hope. You know, again, the use of it doesn't, and sometimes it does have to be veiled. This seeing it through another means. It is too much to see. So we also know how to use drapery, shroud, mantle. Here's a perfect example here, Our Lady's mantle, where she becomes the church herself. It's Iglesia. As we get into the period of Enlightenment, we see a not so great shift in terms of Catholic art, where a new kind of realism is entering, although things are still, they do not have that sacred fire that we see in the Donatello or Caravaggio. Yes, we have people like Bouguereau, who does beautiful, beautiful paintings, and we're rediscovering more and more about them. Did they become devotional art? Not necessarily, because that's one thing that we do maintain in the church is that it's not decorative. It has a function. It has a function. And part of the reason why we don't use realism or hyperrealism is because of that function. It's very, very hard to become contemplative when you're thinking of who modeled for that or how they modeled. And in fact, when I think of the tapestries in the LA Cathedral, that's the problem. You know, you see these kids with sneaks or whatever, and they're very, very photographic, they're very, very well done, but they're so realistic, in a sense, that they're hard to, they don't have the, it's like me, but it's not like me factor. They are like me. And most likely they will age more quickly because of the realism. This is Ang's Our Lady of the Eucharist. Fulgur's Tarsicius. This is a beautiful piece. And you can see during the Second Empire in France, this kind of, it was a beautiful art form. There's no doubt about it. No doubt about it. I could easily live with this statue of Tarsicius. I think it's a magnificent piece. And again, the late 19th century tries to mid-19th century even tries to mimic some of the mystical. It's I'm not saying that these are bad or unworthy, but they are not functioning as devotional. This is Delacroix, who always gets considered one of the bad boys of the whole Romantic period. And this part of his work, when he decides I've had enough of the avant-garde world, and he gets a little apartment down the street from Saint-Sulpice and goes voluntarily every day to paint the ceilings, not in the books. So you could already see a split between the secular world and the secular world always followed the church, and for many, many years and centuries actually did. This is Manet's Dying Christ. Again, this is an early Impressionist artist. Rodin, this is his Eve. There's still, sort of one foot in both worlds, as it were. It's an interesting period, and one that perhaps we should look at as to how we lost it. Degas was probably one of the last people to see both worlds, but the use of the nude really gets relegated to bathing at this point in time in history. It's disappearing from, it's only for genre. Nuditas temporalis, that's all we're left with. That's it. We could still see, this is interesting though. This is where there's a little bit of switchover. The Reformed Church is actually using the body now more than we are, mainly because their artists are more either capable, willing, affordable, When we think of the early church in the United States, these massive immigrants coming over, you wonder why, how do we get all these polychrome plaster sculptures that are all staying there doing nothing? They were easy to ship, they were affordable. No, seriously, you have to consider that. It's almost like remember, we were a pilgrim church until 1919. We've only been, on our own for, 90 years now? That's not too long. The idea of realism really hits, this is an actual flayed figure his name is Thomas Banks, and the Peel brothers were involved in this, taking this criminal, and he was hung. They had permission to flay him instantly, and because they wanted to see what would happen, how would the muscles atrophy in crucifixion. And you can see the realism doesn't really matter. It's not what it's about. And of course, Akins follows in that same theme and introduces here in Philadelphia, another kind of figure. We are no longer, this is a big proportion change. Like I was talking about the Mannerist period where they had 8, 9, 10 heads. Before that, during the Renaissance, and after that, it's usually what we call an 8-headed figure. Akins introduces the 7.5, which is more like what we are. We run about 7.5, 7¾ head units. And this is his crucifixion. Again, a worthy painting in terms of art, but doesn't have the devotional function. Realism, again. Head of the Baptist. Not really. It's whoever had their head through the hole in the table that day. And this is, it's a real important point because, last year I walked into a church thinking, because they always had Stations of the Cross, and they had these beautiful 19th century stations. And I go in and nobody's there, and I said, well, where is everybody? I go downstairs, and I see everybody sitting around like this. And I said, what's going on? We're doing stations. I said, there's no stations down here. Father's doing something different. And I see this unironed, not really clean sheet thrown over the sacrificial altar. And I turned around and I saw a slide projector. I said, I'm out of here. Because you know what's going to happen. We're going to get slides from Jesus of Nazareth, from the Passion of Christ, all these, and we got to, the thing about a photograph is it's always of the time it was taken. It's always a memento. And it's one thing we don't do in Catholic art is turn our art into mementos that can only stay in that time zone. So, in other words, a photograph is always of the past. It's never of the now. This is another 19th century piece, St. Perpetua. This was in Brookstone Gardens, down in North Carolina. And they gave their religious art over to Mepkin Abbey because it was a little too embarrassing. Mepkin said, fine, we'll take it. This is a perfect use of nudity in Catholic art, where Perpetua, under Roman law, she could not be she could not be killed until she gave birth. She was pregnant when she was arrested. So they waited until she gave birth and then crucified her. This is Bloch, who was a wonderful, wonderful painter. Again, his sense of realism did not lend itself. This is where almost too much information can be harmful. They're beautifully, beautifully done. And but where do we sort of put it together? This is another Tissot, Jacques Tissot. He was a contemporary of Degas. Did French society painting and English society painting for years. And one day just said, I'm going to Palestine. And spent his entire life illustrating both Old and New Testament. And somehow the entire collection is in the Brooklyn Museum. They are wonderful, wonderful pieces. And this is right here in Philadelphia. This is in Manayunk. This is another good example of 19th century carving. This is a St. John the Baptist. So the artisan level was going high, but the art level was low. Do you know what I mean by that? It was getting handed over to strictly artisans who were beautiful, beautiful craftsmen, but any sort of spiritual invention was pretty much missing. And you can see how it evolved into this. And, again, we're going to have a reaction against this. And I do have a fear that, because of our lacking for so many years, that if we return to a figurative sense, we may go back to that. This is the drawing of St. John, by St. John of the Cross, that's kept in the cloister in Avila. St. John did this, and in 1956, Pius XII asks Dali to look at it, and he goes to visit it, and of course Dali immediately responds. And Pius XII is really trying to get artists to come back to the church. We need you and you need us, as John Paul says in his letter to artists. The church needs you and you need the church. And this year's 10 years, it's a 10-year anniversary from that letter. And of course we know this as the crucifixion of St. John of the Cross. And supposedly it's because St. John wanted to, because he would often take the crucifix to a dying person and lay it down to them to kiss. And he wanted to experience that himself. This is the National Gallery as well. This painting, this Dali's Last Supper is, it's not the Da Vinci, is it I, Lord? He makes everybody, this entire bilateral system of composition here, much like the body itself. This Christ figure that is both here and there. Again, this idea of presence, witness, and transfiguration, all in one painting. I think it's an incredible piece. Here's his Christopher Columbus Discovering America. Not really. If you look at the clothing on Christopher Columbus, he did not wear that. We know that. Okay, this is Cristoforo, Christ carrier, bringing Iglesia to the New World. And of course, these are the new proportions that modernism introduces. And I was saying this to Matthew, I think I was saying this to Matthew earlier, about, you can never underestimate the power that modernism has and has. If it can change the art of the Catholic Church, it's some pretty nasty stuff. And we forget about that, just how potent it was. This is Gaudi, whose cathedral is wonderful, but the carvings are just, they're more...
That wasn't Gaudi, that's Gaudi's church, but that's not his work.
He supposedly designed some of it.
I remember reading that.
He didn't do that? That's good. Thank you.
He died before any of that stuff.
Oh, really? Oh, great.
They actually hired an atheist to continue the work. And he proves this stuff. And you look at it, there's no way if you look at the stuff that he...
Yeah, okay. I was taught that. Thank you.
Maybe
Boy,
I'm wrong.
I'm hoping you're right. On the Feast of St. Joseph, I am hoping you are so right. Because, and again, we use flatness, but not in the Byzantine sense of flatness to make this other space, this other reality. We have a little bit of break now and then. This is Giacomo Manzu and the Doors of Death from the Vatican. Again, John the 23rd invites him in, says, we need you. We need artists to do this stuff. He started in the 50s, and of course they were completed in the 60s. There's John 23rd on the bottom, who modeled for Manzu a few times. But Manzu, starts to use the bishop as a motif. Again, starts to become art about art, and not about the church. The other contemporary of his is Pietro Annigoni, who does some incredible fresco work and has taught a whole school of fresco painters here, Ben Long, etc., and his whole following. Some of you are familiar with him, who does church frescoes. And then, going back to that Mies van der Rohe proportion, we've all seen this. This is in St. Francis. This is in Assisi. So the longing for this corporeal Christ is reduced to this sort of, how would Henry Moore do a crucifix? And it becomes more about the identity of the artist than the identity of the Catholic desire. Christ and Mary. I mean, we have the idea, by the way, that flatness relates more to a Quaker idea of a silhouette where the flesh is proud. We can't do anything corporeal, because they did associate the corporeal with the Catholic faith. And how are we supposed to go from this kind of stuff? How do you go from that to that? And you wonder why, so many Catholics say, oh, the Eucharist, that's a symbol. It's just a symbol. When we take the corporeal Christ out of, all our devotional art, it's going to have an effect. We are stuck with two things as Catholic: a virgin birth and an empty tomb. And we have to fill in a whole lot. I think the challenge of the Catholic artist is incredible in the sense that we are not given this thing like the Byzantine school where you got to keep in these lines and we are constantly called to invent and reinvent and reinvent. God has left us the incorrupt, again, as signs of our coming. St. John Vianney, the Year of the Saint, this is incredible. But again, the resurrection body is in there, and this desire to touch this risen Christ continues. And we have to put it back into our theology and our liturgy and our artwork. There's no doubt about it. We're not seeing this enough today. We're not seeing it. We're seeing these sort of over-the-counter Mary, Joseph, salt and pepper shaker kind of things. And we're also, but the sad thing is we're also depriving artists of the experience. We're not calling them. We're not expecting enough from them. But we see the desire of our saints to hold the Christ child or the suffering Christ. This one, by the way, is in the exhibit in D.C. Again, St. Bernard holding the risen Christ. But we have to make a connection between those two things somehow. Again, the connection is there. We have to realize it's there. That this is no different from the road to Emmaus. Walking with Christ in procession is the same thing. And this is our Philadelphia, Christ breaking the bread. Walter Erlbacher, who was one of my teachers, again, made him unrecognized. You will recognize him in the breaking of the bread. If there wasn't the breaking of the bread there, and Walter was a Jew who understood that. He worked with Father John Miller on this. This was done for the Eucharistic Congress. Walter wanted to know. He said, I won't do it without an advisor. And Walter wanted to do something of an early Christian nature of an Apollo Christ, right? Took this form, beardless young man breaking bread. You will recognize him in the breaking of the bread. This is another, I want to talk about some contemporary people who really have been trying. This is Frederick Hart, of course, who did the triglyph at the National Cathedral, not Catholic, but incredible piece of work, totally unheralded. When this was unveiled, not even the Washington Post gave it one line. Again, the power of modernism. This is Benjamin Wolfe. He's doing a crucifix. It's very nice modeling. So it's happening, it is happening. Of course, it gets tough because you'll have a hand like that being forced to put it into a modernist space, where light behind statues doesn't work. I'm sure they didn't want anything there. I'm sure they just wanted to, this is an Italian artist, Manzoni. This is his first station. They're beautiful. Just Christ's figure alone, ecce homo. The condemnation of Christ. Too realist. This is actually a painting. It's not a photograph. But again, you think of model in the studio. And this is my point about why you can't use photographs in Catholic art. or for stations. This is the raising of Lazarus. Very sort of modern approach. I'm not sure it quite gets it, but again, the attempt is there. This is a new statue of St. Ignatius at Boston University. This is the same artist who did the resurrection of Lazarus. This is his St. Faustina Divine Mercy painting out at La Crosse. Again, trying to get away from the holy card image of Divine Mercy. It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. And of course, some of you have seen sculptures of it. It doesn't work as a sculpture either. But some beautiful painting is happening again. And again, a sense of the corporeal is returning. But we do have to somehow reconcile this art world with the photograph. This is a photograph of Blessed Miguel Pro at his execution. Right? This is we know what some of our saints look like now. And Nielsen Carlin was commissioned by Archbishop Burke to do the painting of Miguel Pro. Neil took that form of his execution, did Blessed Miguel as a priest, elevating the Eucharist to the Trinity above with Our Lady of Guadalupe on his chasuble. So all the sign and symbol work together we wanted two communicants, Mexican communicants holding up a crown of laurel and a crown of thorns. Yes?
Where is that?
That's in La Crosse. This is the new architecture by Duncan Stroik, La Crosse, Wisconsin, the Shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Father Benedict Rochelle. So again, we're confronted with, I don't know. Yeah, it is, because it's got a sense of presence, but it's not a photographic kind of thing. This is a new statue in the National Basilica of Mother Teresa. New composition. It's pretty nice. So again, we are seeing a turnaround here. We just do have to keep the momentum up. This is a Spanish artist I communicate with. He does a lot in Seville, especially during Holy Week. This is the triumph of Iglesia over sin. Spanish do have this thing. They know the right amount of realism to put in. It's amazing. He's a young guy. He's just, starting out, but boy, I was impressed. This is some of his work. And you see how, it corresponds to a 17th century corpus. They can live together. Because it's one thing that the church just, a lot of times, because the work I do, they'll say, oh, well, it'll be done by dedication day. I would say, Father, thank God the church will never be complete on earth. You've got entire liturgical calendar to dedicate things and keep it, because all we ask is that quality match quality. That's all we've ever asked for in our church art and architecture. Whoops, oh, darn. That was the, sorry. This is James Langley, another Catholic artist in the United States, Holy Family. Tom, what's Tom's last name from St. Patrick's? What's his last name? Hillary? I don't remember. Incredulity of Thomas. This is in a church in Long Island. These are new compositions. This is Our Lady Pregnant. I'm seeing more statues of Our Lady Pregnant, which is a really, really, really good sign, because we probably need it now more than ever. The idea of the unborn Christ child probably has to, I can see a place for this in every church. So this desire, this ongoing desire to either touch Christ directly or touch the flesh through another, either through another saint, helping the suffering, has been a dominant theme, probably even greater than the Nativity and Crucifixion, throughout all of Catholic art. There's always this desire to touch. Most religions have it. Muslims will touch the floor, and Jews will kiss the mezuzah or whatever. We want to kiss and touch Christ. It's a whole different thing. And I'll end here. This is a piece I did at St. Rita's, the Christ of Holy Saturday, the resurgent Christ figure, which it's believed St. Rita indeed on Good Friday received her stigmata in front of this image, not that relief, of course, but a fresco was in her cell. The resurgent Christ, or what they call Cristo di Sabato Santo, the Christ of Holy Saturday, was actually a more dominant theme than the crucifix itself because, again, they didn't exist. This idea of a life-size corpus just wasn't there. And this also appears, this Christ with his hands folded appears on her coffin lid. So we thought, well, let's see if we can work that into the entire iconography of the shrine. And I'll end here.
Is that all you have of your work? You don't have anything from Guadalupe?
No.
No.
Well, it's because it didn't go in. Well, it does go in. But it wasn't about my work. But